Hi, I'm Radical Liberation, broadcasting for the first time, I think, from my home office, where the internet is now nice and speedy, and so hopefully things should go well with the stream. I upgraded it since I now have to work at home, and so the poor semi-rural internet I had before was not cutting it. But I've got pretty darn good internet now, so hopefully everything should go really well. I have with me Mad Mercenary from Australia,
Hello.
and we're going to talk about inflation today and how it doesn't relate to depression and so forth. Don't want to spend too much time on this because we've already spent plenty of time talking about how governments have been doing like a QE on steroids lately, but they've gone further. So, Mad Mercenary, tell us, keep us up to date with what the governments are doing to help economically.
Well, the central banks, especially the Fed, over the last 2 weeks have taken it to the next level, and they have decided that there's not enough liquidity in the system, and that corporations and primary dealers shouldn't go bust. Therefore, to get the bad stock and corporate bonds off the balance sheets of primary dealers, the Fed has decided in its infinite wisdom to directly buy corporate stock and put it on their balance sheet, since they're a non-profit entity, quote unquote. So now the central bank directly owns corporations' stock. I think you can all see the implications of such a move, but that's the Fed's wisdom and prerogative to do that. So,
okay, and actually, let's go slightly deep. Let's go slightly deeper on that. Maybe connecting up to some things we've discussed in the past about negative interest rates and so forth. Why did they feel they had to go to that level? From their perspective, just speak from their perspective for a moment. Like, okay, why take ownership?
From their perspective, the stocks are losing value. They're not performing. They're losing value. So on the balance sheets of primary lenders, they're not as good as they used to be. So they're losing money. So you have to trade more of them to get less. So the Fed is seeing this, and the Fed is saying, well, we can't allow this to happen. We can't allow liquidity to drop, because then the whole system goes to hell, because no one can pay off their debts because everything is so over leveraged these days.
So wait, I'm sorry. Liquidity would go to hell because people just stop buying stocks? What do you mean?
Stocks aren't as valuable, so they don't fetch as much as they did in the market. So if they can't fetch as much as they did in the market, then the amount of money that will be traded in the market goes down.
Ah, okay. So they want to keep, how do we put this? They want to keep financial markets, like equities markets, say. They want to keep money flowing through equities markets, basically.
Keep them valuable. Keep them valuable. Therefore, when it's traded, the money that is traded for the equities is then used to service the debt. Not the Fed's debt, corporate debt.
Right. So why can't they just solve this problem by continuing to, from their point of view, continuing to lower interest rates, put more what is the thing they do? The treasury bonds, the normal stuff they do.
Right. First problem is that because the value of these treasury bonds and corporate bonds is going down, the yields are going up. So there's an inverse relationship here. When the yields go up, no one can afford to pay the yields. So it's like a domino effect. No one wants to buy these treasuries because the yields are going up and no one has the ability to pay the yields. This forces interest rates up naturally. So,
and they want them low. They want interest
low.
Rates low. Yeah. Okay.
They want them low. Exactly. So the Fed will just say, well, we're a non-profit entity. We're not concerned about profit. We can just print all the money we want. We will go to our primary lenders, and we will say, which is the big banks, and we will say, hey, we'll take those treasuries off you. We'll take the corporate bonds off you. We can't allow the yields to increase on those, so we're just going to take them off you. We're going to buy them, keep demand artificially high. That way the yields don't increase. And we will inject liquidity into the system as a result. It's not working, however. It's not enough liquidity to get everyone through and service all their debts that are being called in because of coronavirus.
Okay.
And so they've stepped it up to the next level. They're directly buying these corporate bonds, which are not fetching as much. These shares, which are not fetching as much.
I
so
see.
Now
okay,
now they have direct semi-ownership of companies.
Okay, so basically they've tried, you might say, the various indirect means to try to keep the stock prices up, and those haven't worked. I haven't been following the equities markets carefully. Is it all just sort of, is it crashing or just continuing to trend downwards?
Stocks are just going downwards. Yields are wanting to increase, but the Fed is printing so much money into reserves of the primary lenders, which is the big banks, by the way. So they're printing so much money into their reserves to lend out that it's artificially keeping it low.
Right, but despite all that, despite there being plenty of money to borrow, what you're saying, like if you're a big company and you want to borrow,
it's not working.
You can find money to borrow, but the stocks are still going down anyway.
Exactly. So the Fed's going to say, we're going to step it up. We're just going to buy the stocks for you. That way, it's not on your balance sheets. It's not, the assets of your balance sheets aren't going down. People will still want to trade with you. It's going to be fine. Don't worry. Don't think about it. And we can all see the consequences of this very clearly in a government entity owning corporate shares.
Right, yeah. I mean, one thing that comes to mind is the state-owned enterprises or quasi-state-owned enterprises that are quite common in big players in China, the China economy, right? What is the difference once the Fed is essentially on the board, right, or a major shareholder? There is, from an economic reality point of view, where the names, the labels put on it might be different, but we're really in state-owned enterprise zone at that point, right?
Right. And Lawrence has a really good question here. You can borrow the money, but if your factory is shut, how can the stocks go up? Well, this is the artificial bubble. There's just so much money running through the system. It's not based on performance. It's not based on company output. It's merely based on bidding up these stocks. So I wouldn't be surprised if we had a crash, but there is a possibility that the Fed could reinflate this bubble, just like they did in 2000 and 2008. So we're still in that same bubble. There is a possibility that they could reinflate it with this new strategy, which is scary because then what that means is we could have an even bigger recession in the future, like 5 years from now. And we think this one's huge. So again, delaying the inevitable.
Right. Whatever problems we're having now, they could be storing up further problems for the future with the moves they're making. Okay, so let's turn to the depressions and inflation/deflation. I want to use as our guide a really excellent article by Joe Salerno, who's in turn summarizing an article, and I'll share the link to, or I've shared the link to one, I'll share the link to the other as well. Summarize an article that was in a major journal. And in this article, he looks at what has been was a long held assumption for about 100 years, which is that there's a link between monetary deflation and depression. All right, and that is, as he summarizes it, a general fall in prices spells unmitigated disaster for overall economic activity. This is, we'll get into the details of the article in just a moment. I'll put it on screen, in fact, but this is really coming from the interpretation that was put on the market crash of 1929 and the subsequent depression. There was a big battle, of course, over how to interpret that, because it made a big impression on everyone. And how you interpret 1929 and the subsequent depression ends up affecting a lot of people's thinking about what the government ought to do about the economy, what the government ought to do at a time like this, right? So it's a big point of contention. Part of what's going to be interesting about this article, as you'll see, is that they looked at more than the depression. Because if we're going to say that there's a connection between monetary deflation and depression, then we ought to be able to see it more than one time, more than one historical episode, right? So that's what they look at. So let's bring this up, and we're going to do one of those, slightly more technical things, but I think it's quite accessible. This, in fact, is not a technical article that we're looking at. It's a popular article from Mises Daily article summarizing a more technical article. Okay, so, well, it's interesting. Interesting historical footnote. This is 16 years ago that Joe wrote this. He starts by mentioning a deflationary boom in China that is generally falling prices, probably for commodities and stuff in China, while there's an economic boom at the same time. As we know, China went from, starving to death, to not put too fine a point on it, not so long ago, to seem to grow quite well economically. And I think in many ways they have done quite well economically, despite there being some flimflammery involved as well. They're not all out there in rice paddies anymore like they were under Mao. Anyway, he mentions that, which is interesting. So, as I said, long-held view, general fall in prices gives you bad results in the economy. And he says, now it's gotten a little more nuanced, and people are starting to talk about good deflation versus bad deflation. But a much more interesting thing happened with this paper by Atkinson and Kehoe. In fact, I've got this ready to share. Let me just put this in the chat. And you can go to the direct source if you like. So what they do is they look at inflation and growth for 17 countries for about 100 years, at least 100 years for each of those countries. And they're basically wanting to test. In fact, I should have that article up in case I want to refer to it. Their title is Deflation and Depression, Is There an Empirical Link? So this is a straight-on empirical study. Nothing fancy here. It's literally just, okay, so there's supposed to be a link between deflation and depression. Well, let's look at data on deflation, inflation, deflation, and data on depression, and let's see how they line up, right? Is there a correlation? And then he goes into explaining how they define deflation and depression and so forth. So they do find a loose link if you look at the Great Depression episode. 8 of the 16, all 16 countries that had data for that period experienced deflation. 8 of the 16 experienced depression. So a loose link, not a one-for-one, but a loose link. Here's what gets interesting, though. If you throw out the Great Depression, they found that 21 of 29 depression episodes were not associated with deflation. In other words, 90% of deflation episodes did not culminate in depression. And so the authors conclude, in a broader historical context beyond the Great Depression, the notion that deflation and depression are linked virtually disappears. So what are they saying here? They're suggesting then that what the data says is that we drew a false connection because of the Great Depression. Yes, there was deflation, wide deflation, price deflation at that time, and there was depression. But that's just one time, and you don't want to draw too much from one historical episode. When you ignore the Great Depression, look at everything else, you find that there's no correlation at all.
Right. So I think the idea of the deflation being the real problem here came from Milton Friedman, if I'm not mistaken.
We're going to get to that. Hold that thought. Hold that thought, because he's going to directly address Friedman and Anna Schwartz, who I think had everyone persuaded. It actually goes back before them, by the way, but they wrote the big book on it. Okay, so and then they say even when there's when you even do it for all episodes, including the Depression, let's see, a 1 percentage point drop in inflation associated with the piddling decline in the average growth of real output of 0.08 percentage points, meaning there's really hardly any association at all, even when you include the Depression. Okay, I'm going to skip that part. Okay, gets into a little more technical stuff. Okay, let me jump to the conclusion. So, data suggests that deflation is not closely related to depressions. A broad historical look finds more periods of deflation with reasonable growth than with depression, and many more periods of depression that go along with inflation than that go along with deflation. The data show virtually no link between deflation and depression. So part of the reason to get into this paper is because some might still have it in their heads that you couldn't have an inflationary depression. That is, money price inflation while also having a depression. I don't know how that could be in people's heads unless literally the only thing they know about is the Great Depression, because I believe the post-World War I Germany would be a really famous episode where there was hyperinflation and depression simultaneously. But somehow that data point doesn't seem to stick in people's minds when it comes to this topic. And especially those who know a little bit about mainstream economics just get afraid of deflation. I wish I had the term, someone came up with the Greek for deflation phobia. It's a great long, really long term. But anyway, okay. And then let's see. Yeah, and then he talks about what this means, what this study means for competing schools of macroeconomics to the Austrians. Let's see, monetary disequilibrium approach, which is popular with the free banking wing of Austrian macro, has serious problems because of this. More interesting for us, I think, is the Friedman-Schwartz explanation. So their explanation was, quoting Friedman, they attributed to the Federal Reserve a major share of the responsibility for the 1929 to 1933 contraction, because specifically, what did the Fed do in their view? It allegedly pursued deflationary policies in the early 1930s. And that's what Friedman, I think, convinced a lot of people of. When you take a broader view, as this paper does, you find that you don't see that correlation at all.
Right. So this was this theory was very popular because people wanted to think I think what Friedman was trying to do here was give people and central banks an option on how to fight depressions and recessions. And I think he basically came up with the very complicated system of quantitative easing that we're using today.
I'm sorry, who came up with quantitative easing?
Milton Friedman.
Okay. So when we use that term, quantitative easing is a term that still sounds new to me. I know it's like they used it a lot 10 years ago, but you know what I mean. It's not like something I remember reading Friedman himself using that term. But you're saying really it's just new terminology for an old strategy, right?
Right. It's just it's an old strategy with a few more steps put in. Is what quantitative easing is.
Okay.
So I think what Milton Friedman was trying to do there, I'm pretty sure it was Milton Friedman who created quantitative easing, but what I believe that Milton Friedman was trying to do was give central banks and governments options on how to fight recessions and depressions.
Right.
Unfortunately, I think he falls into the trap here that many people do of thinking that printing money equals the creation of wealth. When it doesn't, we understand that production is what really grows and drives the economy.
Yeah, I don't know if I would attribute that to Friedman exactly. I think that's how almost everybody thinks of it, you know. But he probably has a sort of more technical reason for why he's thinking that way that has to do with bad monetary economics, basically, you know. But anyway, overall, I think you're right. I think we see it with Milton Friedman here, with Keynes, and by the way, this interpretation of the Great Depression goes back to Irving Fisher, who was a very famous American economist at the time, became a bit infamous after the 1929 crash because he was being quoted just before then saying, you know, this will never crash, you know, like we're never going to have crashes anymore. And then the stock market crashed like a month later or something, you know. But Irving Fisher continued to have a lot of influence, I think, even despite his bad prophesying. And he really tried to sell this idea that it had to do with deflation. And then Friedman and Schwartz did sort of the definitive book where they tried to prove this in 1,000 pages or so. I've seen the book. It's massive. So yeah, it goes quite back. I agree. I think it's popular. As we've seen with the response to the coronavirus, there is this assumption that, not an assumption, but almost an emotional need for the state to do something. And in a way, it seems to almost not matter what it is. It makes me think of like at the airports with or American airports, at least the TSA, the Transportation Security Administration. They have us do take our shoes off and all this stuff. And as security experts have said, it's security theater. And they regularly, you know, journalists and stuff sneak stuff through just to show how useless the whole system is. But it makes people feel like, hey, we're doing something. We're not going to have a terrorist attack on a plane anymore because, you know, we're taking our shoes off and standing in lines and stuff like that. Similarly, with this response to the coronavirus, I think the idea is, you know, if we shut down the economy and everything, we're definitely doing the right thing to stop this virus. We might be, right. We might not be. I'm not sure. I'm kind of trying to figure that out. But one thing is for sure, if the state just does nothing at a time like this, then some people will be like, you're failing. You should do something. Well, we don't even have something to do that would be helpful. We don't care. Just do something. And so when it comes to economic downturns, it's the same thing. Well, you've just do something, you know?
Right. And this is where the political pressure and the economic arguments clash. Or economic arguments bend to political pressure,
right?
Because while it may not be economically sound to take an action or do implement a law or grandstand, it may not economically do anything or may even economically hurt. the nation, what it can do is win votes.
Right.
What it can do is show people that you care and that you're loving and that you're one of them and you want to help them, and it buys the next election.
Yeah, it's economic policy making by sentiment, right?
Exactly.
And unfortunately, there are people who believe, my favorite Australian left winger, Caitlin Johnston, is one of these. But there's people on the right that are this way, absolutely, as well. There's people who believe that the economy is basically purely sentiment. Scott Adams, I hear the same thing from Scott Adams. Look, if you just, if you're like Trump and you just sort of talk everything up, everything will be fine because everyone will be optimistic. And if everyone's optimistic, then the economy does well. Well, actually, the economy isn't just pure emotion. I mean, it's based on our desires and subjective desires and wants and so forth, right? But the structure of the economy has something more to it than just how we're feeling. So that's the problem with that approach, that talk it up approach, and do something approach.
The talk it up approach doesn't, like, I understand the idea, but I think it misses out on like the hard facts of, well, I could believe in what's Elon Musk's space, is it SpaceX, his flight?
That's not his, but yeah, I know.
His whatever his space program is. I could really want to go to space. I could believe in space. I could be like Werner von Braun, all right? I could be obsessed with space. That doesn't change the fact that that company is not profitable and is very, very expensive to operate.
Right.
Right. So it doesn't change hard facts. So you can believe, you can be very optimistic about the future, but unless the economics line up, unless there's a healthy business model, unless there's good production, unless there's low debt and high savings, it's not going to happen. So emotion is not the only thing to consider here.
Okay, so I want to cover one more thing from history, and then unless you have other things to bring in, I'm happy to just go to responding to some of the comments, and that'll take us to other topics that are related to this. So the other thing to bring up, and Academic Agent brings this up on a pretty regular basis, but I knew about this before I knew him. The other thing to bring up is that one of the best periods of economic growth in modern times, which would be the period of the 19th century, where the world probably got its closest in many ways to sort of a libertarian international economic order. Lots of free trade and fantastic economic growth in England, of course, with the ongoing industrial revolution there, but also in other parts of Europe and the United States. And what you saw during that time was deflation. That is, and this is a really neat feature of a relatively free market, you could literally put money, preferably like real money, like gold or something, commodity money. You could put money in your mattress, and that was actually not a terrible strategy, because as the economy advanced, you would reap some of the benefits of that advancing economy by your money actually buying more things. That's what deflation means, right? When we talk about deflation, we're talking about commodity price deflation. If you flip it and think about the money side of things, deflation means your money is becoming more valuable. For obvious reasons, the mainstream and the Fed and people like that don't tend to talk about deflation that way, right? Because it'd be a much harder sell to say, we have got to keep your money from becoming more valuable. We've got to do everything. We've got to throw everything in the kitchen sink at this economy to keep your money from becoming more valuable. Well, that'd be a difficult marketing line to take, right?
Can you imagine what would happen to the repo market? What would happen to corporate bonds? What would happen to treasuries? What would happen to the stock market if we were enter into devaluation?
Right. So
deflation.
spell that out. So
So
I was speaking from the perspective of the consumer. From the perspective of the consumer, if my money
if your money as
ideally
a consumer,
gently, slowly, gently just becomes, it buys more and more stuff. Imagine, sorry, let me just extend the analogy for just a moment. Think about like with computer technology, where in general, what your money can buy in terms of RAM, CPU power, so on and so forth, now versus what it can buy 20 years ago, you can't even compare it, right? My money is so much more valuable in terms of consumer electronics. What it can get for me, I could literally put, $1,000 in my mattress 20 years ago, use it now to buy consumer electronics, and get something way more valuable than I could have with $1,000 20 years ago. Imagine that though, except it's not just consumer electronics. It's cars, it's everything is becoming cheaper. Your money is becoming more valuable, more useful to purchase cars and so on and so forth, right? So that's the perspective of the consumer. But you're saying there's another angle on this, which is not an aspect of the free market really, but go ahead.
yeah, if you found out that your money was more valuable the next day, obviously as a consumer, you're going to be fantastic. You're going to be thinking, wow, this is great. But if you're the central bank, what you're seeing there is, oh, holy crap. Now our money's more valuable. What's going to happen to all the debt that we owe? All of our debts just also increased.
Well, let's see. The debt increases. Oh, right. I see what you're saying. The
Yeah,
money the money that you
liquidation
borrowed
of
is
malinvestments.
it's more expensive to pay off money debt as the money becomes more valuable, I guess, is what you're saying, right?
Well, yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
So the the debt becomes harder to get rid of for essentially your like assets don't hold like just in pure dollar amounts aren't worth as much because the money isn't going up. And this sort of situation where the market kind of just goes to a screeching halt because of deflation. The Fed's been trying to, and other central banks around the world have been trying to stave this off. So we've been seeing
Mhm.
low interest rates and that sort of stuff. That's primarily because of the people who live in nations. So and pu- uh, the age pyramid, the age of people in the nation. So because the Western world had essentially a baby bust during the 70s and 80s, it it can no longer consume at the rates it was. So if it's no longer consuming at the rates it was, naturally what will happen is that we will have deflation. So things become more valuable.
Mhm.
And the government has been printing money at extraordinary rates to try and stave off this deflation as well as prop up the market.
Right. Okay. So I want to go ahead to the chat because I think it's going to lead us into plenty of other topics. So I want to make sure we have lots of time. But before we do that, let me just ask, what does this mean to us in the coming months as we think about inflation, deflation, and depression? One thing we're interested in, right, is does all this pumping up that the Fed and I assume other central banks are doing, does it start leaking out? And do we see one possibility for sure, right? I'm not predicting this, but certainly a possibility is that all this money that's been loaned results in very bad price inflation, right? It doesn't just sit there in the bank's reserves. It gets loaned out, and suddenly we're finding that we go to the store and prices are 50% higher or double 4 or 5 months from now. This can happen. It has happened in history.
Right.
I'm not putting big odds on it, but it is possible given what they've done, right, Madmer?
The title card, excuse me, not the title card, the thumbnail that I made is just a fraction of the fiat currencies that have gone into hyperinflation. So you'll see some of the notes there, like the Zimbabwean dollar. That's $1 trillion note. This happens. They're not. We're not talking academic here. Inflationary depression happens.
Right. Yeah, you got it. Did you get a Zimbabwean? I'm looking for it.
Yep, top one.
Top middle. Yeah.
Yep.
100. Does
That's
it really say
trillion.
100 trillion? Love it. 100.
Yep,
100.
trillion.
It sounds like what's his name? $100 trillion. You know.
Yeah.
Mr. Evil or whatever. Sorry, can't remember. Yeah, right. So this really does happen in real life. Here's some evidence that you put in the thumbnail image. So yeah, that is a possibility in the coming months, is that their attempt to stave off a depression, a deflation, both, I don't know, results in inflation that people get, that seriously inconveniences people, right? The money you kept in your savings, your paycheck, all of them are buying less and less each day because this money has leaked out. Now, having said that, I don't think we saw massive price inflation after all the QEing of 12 years ago or whatever it was, 11, 12 years ago, right? I don't think there was massive, I'm sure there tends to just be steady price inflation over time. But we didn't see like doubling of consumer prices.
No, we didn't. We didn't see doubling.
Right. And the reason, as I understand it, is that, yes, the Fed handed out a lot of money like candy to banks, but they didn't loan the money out.
No, so the effects of the inflationary policy was somewhat limited to just the money markets and the repo markets, somewhat. But obviously, there's a filtering down effect where this money will inevitably make it into average everyday prices, and this comes to a very important point where the inflationary policy of the Fed, it will the people who will see the benefit from it initially will be the banks and the corporations in the repo market, because they're the first ones exposed to this inflationary policy.
Right.
But the average everyday person won't see the benefits. They'll just see eventually the higher prices.
Right. The Cantillon effect.
Exactly.
It doesn't just, Friedman imagined, I think it was Friedman, imagined a helicopter just sort of raining money evenly across the whole economy, right? But it doesn't actually work that way. The money that the Fed injects starts somewhere in the economy. And so some people are earlier to see that new money, and some people are later. The people that are earlier get to buy things at basically yesterday's prices with additional money. The people at the end of the line are buying things with inflated prices, but the same money they had before, and their money's just losing value, right? And it tends to be a little class analysis about it. It tends to be the people who are more vulnerable, people on fixed incomes, people who are poor, people who are not politically connected. They tend to be the ones who are last in line. The ones who are closer to the state, closer to the seats of power, tend to be first in line, including, of course, military contractors and banks and things like that. Okay, so let's go to the chat.
I'd just like to add one point, that it's going to be interesting to see, because are you guys introducing like a direct investment to individual citizens as we are here?
I think so. I heard about that, but then I heard some stuff, but then I never saw anyone saying, "Oh yeah, it's coming." But supposedly in May, that everybody gets a couple. It's a couple $1,000s per person, or 1,500 per person, something like that. It's not a huge amount, really.
No, it's not. It's not like a 20 grand check per person. But
it's a small percentage. It's a small percentage of the money they're handing to the banks. Let's put it that way.
It is. It's a very small percentage.
Very small. Yeah.
But it's going to be interesting to see how prices react, because there's the Cantillon effect is being bypassed, and we're just going to see it directly in the hands of individual people. So it's going to be interesting to see what prices how prices are affected, and how consumer spending changes and what they're spending it on.
Okay, I am going to go to chat. Yes, and you would think that when everybody gets a certain amount of money, I mean, it's just going to be price inflation, right? I mean, it's more dollars chasing less stuff. So it's going to show up somehow. Okay, let's see. Trying to get past all the chatter for some reason about the distributist. Not sure why. Okay, well, Clossington says something, and I don't think this is quite right. He says deflation is the cure to rotten investments. I would say that a bust is a cure for rotten investments. Deflation, I would distinguish, as we have been, I would distinguish from that, right? So, like I said, in the 19th century, you saw a steadily advancing economies, while there was a gentle but steady price deflation. So that gentle but steady price deflation was not curing any rotten investments or anything. The cure of the rotten investments is the bust. It's when there's a realization throughout the economy that we cannot keep some of these projects going that we thought we were going to do. You know, we were going to build the tallest tower in the world, and now we're just going to stop. Or as I saw 12 years ago in this rich area of Florida, South Florida, where my parents were, they were just building like crazy around there. And literally I saw pictures, I think I used Google Maps, Google Earth, you know, and I could see neighborhoods where they were building a subdivision or whatever, and it was just stopped in the middle. There was like 2 houses, and then the rest of the lots were just sitting there empty, and have been for years, you know, because they were just going crazy building. And then there was that bust 12 years ago, and then they just stopped, and because, you know, those investments were not really making sense once we got a little more dose of reality. So I disagree on that. The more they inflate, the more depressed I get. That's a good one. Watch Britain's Toughest Villages. Is that a TV show?
No idea.
I would like that. Let's see. Always happy to slip that one in. Money Printer Go Brr.
Extra R's on this one.
Yeah. Okay, so it's nationalized, but only X% of the company. Yes, right. So remember, Mises talked about socialism of the Russian variety and socialism of the German variety. And what he meant by that was that in socialism of the Russian variety, the USSR, they would outright take over the factory. And it was now a factory of the people, or whatever, you know, factory of the People's Republic, or I don't know how they called them, but that was the basic idea. And so nominal and real ownership was in the hands of the communist state. In Germany, though, they did something more subtle, which the leftists have made caused great confusion with, because they left nominal ownership in private hands. But the owners of the factory had to do what the Nazis told them, what the Nazi government told them. So, you know, if you own something, but you can't decide what to do with it, in what sense do you own it, right? It literally is just nominal, your ownership.
You can do what you want as long as you do what we say.
Exactly, right. So really, National Socialism, in many ways, was on the same kind of socialist path as the international socialists in the Soviet Union were. They just made it kind of look different on paper. And therefore, you get all this unending crap from the left wing about how National Socialism was like capitalism on steroids or something like that. Like, this is where capitalism leads you. And it just makes no sense. It's just socialism with, it's a shell game. It's socialism with something to confuse you about what's really going on.
And the thing is that with the Fed today, the direct ownership of corporate stock is they call it a loan, but the loans are 0% interest rates.
Right.
On the loan, so.
Right. I think you know that the ownership is real when the government is like, I don't know, dictating what the company does. They're like saying, you can't do that. That's supporting Nazis or something, or whatever the politically correct thing of the day is, because we're part owner of this company, so we're telling you to some degree what to do. But yes, Lawrence Tim's comment, nationalize but only percent of the company. Maybe think of it this way: national socialism X%, right? This firm is now nationally socialized 20% or 15% or whatever. Yeah, actually, have you seen any percentages, Medmerk? Is it like 1%, 10%, half the company?
I think it's too soon to tell at the moment, and I don't think the Fed likes to say that sort of information.
Right? Will we even be able to figure it out? That'll be interesting to see.
That'll be interesting. But the thing is that it's hopefully what they're saying, whether you believe the Fed or not, it's up to you. But hopefully, what they're saying is that this is just a temporary loan. And
meaning they're gonna back out.
Exactly, and they did a tiny bit of this during 2008, but nothing to.
Which I'm told they did back out of it in 2008.
Yeah, they did.
That is, they sold off their shares. They got out of those companies eventually. The problem, of course, is it's a when the crisis is over thing, right? Well, what if the crisis isn't over for 5 years?
Exactly.
That is, there isn't a convenient moment. There isn't a convenient moment to back out. Eventually it's like, well, is 5 years temporary? Is 10 years temporary? When do we just say we're doing National Socialism, 25% or whatever? Another great comment from Lawrence. They're keeping the prices high while nobody has a job. Great plan. Yeah, that is a really good point. One of the things that happened in 1920-21 in the U.S., something Austrians love to cite because that's where they handled it more like we would recommend. They just let everything readjust, and it was painful, but it was short, sharp, and over in like a year and a half. And so what did that mean? That meant that with the economy taking a downturn, prices were allowed to fall, companies were allowed to downsize, but that meant you had lower prices for consumer goods, and you were freeing up resources for the economy to be redirected to what it should have been doing rather than what the pumped up economy was doing, right? So in the case of 1920-21, you can imagine part of what was going on is that it was adjusting from the wartime, World War I wartime economy. And there was a nice, they probably tried to keep it going a couple of years after the U.S. ended its involvement with the war. And then it fell apart. And then those companies went away that had been there because of wartime spending. And there started to be companies that made sense for the economy, right? So yes, there's a benefit for the government to not do anything and to just let the economy do its thing, let the economy make its adjustment. But there's some people who just don't want to let it do that. Go ahead.
Well, I was about to say, artificially increasing demand is like putting a tarp over workmen's building materials. So if you have this artificial demand for something, everyone thinks, oh, there's plenty of resources, there's plenty of demand, so I'm just going to keep making this product or providing this service. When when the real quantity of the resources were finally revealed after you remove the tarp, then the economy has to be readjusted, just as the house design has to be readjusted. Because you think you have a certain amount of resources, so you think you have a certain amount of bricks and timber and nails, but if you don't, and you're misled because of the artificial nature of the market, you have to then redesign, reorientate the company to where you can finish what you were doing. You can productively have that company or redesign that house, in other words. And it's better to do that at the start of the house or in the beginning of the market so you're not as affected.
Right. Let's jump to Clossington. He says speculation greater than real production. I'm assuming he's being making a joke there, but yes, that seems to be how they think sometimes.
There's one from idle time.
Go ahead. Say again.
Right at the bottom, right at the latest chat, there's one from idle time.
Oh, way down?
Yeah.
Silver?
No, one above it. The price of precious metals are currently in US dollars. Gold is at $16.85 and 60 cents, and silver is at $15.40.
That's pretty good, actually, right? Pretty good price for gold. For holders of gold, that's actually pretty decent. Let's see. I need to start moving quicker. I thought we had plenty of time, but we got a lot of comments, I'm realizing. Where was I? Sorry. So speculation greater than real production, funny. Let's see. Idle Time says these measures are so much more dramatic than 2008. I think we've been making that clear in previous episodes, but that is my perception. You'd agree with that, right, Mad Merc?
In aggregate, yeah.
Yeah, I mean the QEing they're doing, the taking positions in companies. I think it's all being done. They're ratcheting up quite a bit from 12 years ago. Let's see. Stocks have actually gone up about 20% from the low. Dow went down to 18,000, is now up to 23,000. Yeah, so he's arguing here, I think, that they've succeeded, or well, for whatever reason, the stocks are creeping back up, right?
Right, but as we've been saying, this can only last a certain amount of time. Eventually, the government debt, private debt has to come due, and there's no amount of printing in the world that can really save it, because again, by printing money, you're not actually creating value. You're not actually increasing the productive ability of the economy. You're just inflating the stock market. So, yeah, stocks have gone up, but how is that helping the average worker?
Here's an interesting comment. What do you think? How many bubbles and inflationary booms will we need until the system collapses? Rothbard said if fiat money could not last forever, he would not need to work against it. I would like to see that quote. I think the Austrian view is that fiat money can't last forever. It will eventually fall apart. We haven't historically seen fiat money be able to last in the long term. Having said that, we do pay a price as they continue to screw the economy up with these measures. I have never seen anyone try to put a number on, five booms and busts and then you're done. I don't think Austrian economics gives us any insight on something like that. Do you have any thoughts on this one, Medmer?
Every fiat currency will fail. It's 100% non-success rate. So it's just a matter of time. I think if that is a Rothbard quote, I think it's correct. It can't work forever. It'll have to go back to a semi or full gold standard, or we just do away with the currency altogether and we move to something like a cryptocurrency or direct gold trade or something like that. But it has to hold value.
Let's see. And I don't know where we were, but Austrian school Übermensch says this is talked about in the Austrian taxonomy of deflation, an essay in the book Money, Sound and Unsound. I wonder if he's talking about when I was talking about deflation phobia. That might be the place for that. I'm not sure.
Well, I'm going to pick up that book because that sounds cool.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds familiar. Deflation. I'm sorry, money, sound, and unsound. That does sound familiar. Let's see. Okay. Lawrence says Venezuela inflation, which caused depression. Yeah, they had inflation, didn't they?
Yes, they have hyperinflation.
Hyperinflation.
One of the notes up there is a Venezuelan. Is it peso? Bolivar?
Is it? Which one?
Just hold on. Remove your thingy.
See.
The one to the right, the $20,000 one.
Oh, okay. On the right, in the middle.
Yeah, right in the middle. That's a Venezuelan bolivar or peso, whatever it is.
Right. There you go. Happening right now. Inflationary depression. Venezuela's leading the way. Aren't we happy? Let's see. Okay. Yeah, so Idle Time says same thing. Venezuela right now is in recession with hyperinflation. Yep.
Well, the thing is that Venezuela used to be this incredibly wealthy and highly productive nation, and now they have socialist and Keynesian economics in charge, where they've nationalized industry and production has gone down, and it's a key example of how just printing money doesn't create wealth. Wealth is generated by production.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I could say more on that. But Alias Jones says, I think it's called the Business Insider Counter Indicator. If Business Insider says this time it's different, it's a month away from being proved the same as ever before. Right. You see this where you start seeing, I think there was even a book published called like Dow 50,000 or Dow 100,000 or something, basically predicting that, it's just up to the stratosphere forever, And once you see that kind of stuff coming out, hold on to your wallet. Trouble's coming.
Yeah, it's not going to work.
Let's see.
Here's the question I'll pose to chat. Do you think we're getting better at it?
Better at which?
As in, with the increase in technology and the ability to move the shells faster and better, do you think we're actually getting better at micromanaging the economy? And with the increase in information that we have through technology.
Oh, who's we? What do you mean?
Well, the government. Sorry, I shouldn't say we. Do you think they are getting better?
The thing is, I think how do I want to put this? I think we could, especially those of us who are involved with financial markets, which in my day job I am, we can get a little too bedazzled by the application of digital technology to, stock markets and so forth. The reality is that the economy ultimately is analog, right? It's property, factories, stores, people working 40 hours a week. You know what I mean? It's none of that stuff really is at a hyper digital pace or anything. All of that stuff is still pretty much more or less the way it's been, I guess you could say that transportation has increased the pace in a sense, right? When we didn't have trains and everything was by horseback, I suppose things moved slower in some real sense. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, I'm just thinking because the Great Depression was caused primarily through tractor and agricultural subsidies and was it Hoover? No, not Hoover.
Hoover was the president when the 1929 crash happened. He was the one who did the first New Deal, and
Hoover
began that whole approach, which FDR continued.
Hoover went to big business like Ford and Remington and other big businesses, other major manufacturers of the time, and basically said, "Hey, don't lower your wages," and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Now, in today's world, that sort of stuff happens just about every day, but we don't see the major crashes. Like, well, we do see major crashes, but we don't see like Great Depression immediately, because it was a relatively short amount of time to when the agricultural and tractor subsidies and the wage manipulation happened to the Great Depression, whereas today it's happening all the time, and we're not seeing it immediately. So I think maybe the best way to phrase this is that the ability for the central bank to stave off the collapse has increased, but the crash will still inevitably happen.
Yeah, I don't know. That might be right. Let's table that. I want to think about that one. Are they better at manipulating the market, basically?
Yeah, are they better at doing that now?
Okay, Alias Jones says the talk it up approach has its uses. If you can grow faster than the bubble, you may be able to keep optimism from the bubble having a hard pop. Yeah, I don't know. Hard to say. I'm not saying that the talk it up, talk it down stuff has no effect. But I think the economy is more real than that sort of psychological sentiment approach gives it credit for. And people are seeing what's actually around them. Am I able to afford the house?
Yeah.
Am I able to buy groceries? Do I have a job? These are all real things that don't go away just because you get happy talk or sad talk from the president or something. Let's see, someone picking on JG for some reason. If I were Werner von Braun, Mad Merc.
Yes.
Okay.
That's funny.
Okay, let's see. I.e., okay. I think he's expanding on this talk it up thing. If the PE, price to earnings ratio, is 15, you can cheerlead while the earnings go from 1 to 2, and the price goes 15 to 20, so the PE ratio goes from 15 to 10 while optimism remains intact. It doesn't change the basic thing he's suggesting, I think.
Yeah, I can see what you mean there. How do I explain this? What you're talking about there is the rate of change over time, and yes, that can change without having a pop, but it has to be so gradual that you would have to it would have to be so gradual and so steady and so staunch in their ability to keep to that track. And I don't have any faith in the Fed keeping to that steady, stable track of we're going to try and reduce the cheerleading, we're going to try and get the balance sheet under control, we're going to try and reduce the amount of inflationary policy that we're doing. Because I think we tried that. We tried that after 2009.
Mm-hmm.
They raised interest rates to 5%. They tried to reduce the balance sheet, and it didn't work.
It didn't. Yeah, they're back to a crazy balance sheet. Even exactly. I think you pointed this out. Even before the coronavirus crisis, they had already been going back on that strategy, right?
Right. So the cheerleading has a factor to do with it, but you also have to rely on people with the incentive to continually encourage bubbles and inflationary growth to be steady and reduce their balance sheets and hold to principle, which I don't have the faith in.
Right. Lawrence says helicopters become cheaper in a deflation, so there's that benefit. Idle time. I've been watching the total assets of the Fed shoot up for the past few weeks and wonder when it will stop. It's just incredible. Yeah, I think given that we usually only do this every 2 weeks, Mad Merc, it might be appropriate. Doesn't need to be the show next time, but might be appropriate to take 5 or 10 minutes and put some graphs up again to just sort of do a spot check on Fed assets and some of the things we've been looking at, negative interest rates. Some of these things that we have been discussing in the past. A lot is moving right now, right? So it'd be really interesting to just kind of do like a 12-month, you know what I mean? Like a 12-month window on a number of different measures that are indicative and just see what are they doing. I've been reading about it, but I haven't been really watching the data. So I think that would be interesting. What do you think?
It's a good idea.
Okay.
I think the market is moving so fast at the moment is that the best way for people to really see what's going on is for them to do it themselves. I can give them an update. I will give them an update at the beginning or end of every show as to what the Fed balance sheet is and what the monetary policy and fiscal policy going on is.
Yeah.
But for people who are really concerned about this, you need to do your own.
Yeah. No,
research.
I understood. It's like day to day. Yeah. It's
exactly.
a very
day to day.
It's a very volatile situation right now. Idle time again. The solution is to not have 100% of your GDP in debt. Yeah, there's a lot of debt. The
entire reason that the Fed is injecting so much liquidity in the system is to cope with the debt. So the government issues treasury bonds for the debt to roll over the debt that it has to get the money that it needs. These treasury bonds are then used in the repo markets for corporate debt as well. So this is debt on inflation. And the only people who are going to suffer from this are not the banks, are not the big corporations. It's going to be the average everyday person when they lose their job.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to move a little faster because I need to wrap it up. Lauren says, if your money becomes more valuable, like in price deflation, if your money becomes more valuable, would you sell your stuff to get more money instead? Actually, that's kind of the opposite. They talk about a flight into real goods. When you get into a inflationary or most especially like a hyperinflationary situation, what you don't want to have is cash, because cash is becoming less valuable every day, right?
Yep.
And so you would like to turn your cash today into goods, which will be worth a lot more cash tomorrow, right? Because cash is losing value so quickly. So it's actually in a hyperinflationary situation, especially, that there's a flight into real goods. People don't want to hold cash. They want to have stuff. Let's see. Funny things, says Raffle something other. Funny thing that 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollars could buy half a bread loaf when it was printed, and now it goes for $100 or so on eBay. I didn't know they were worth that much. That's awesome. Good for the Zimbabwe.
Well, this is a secondary market, isn't it, for weird and wonderful currency around the world. So the $1 trillion note as $1 trillion may not be worth much, but as a collector item, it can be bid up.
Yeah, right. Lawrence says the Royal Mint have a gold standard coin. I watched their video about it, and it was very sad. I don't know what he means by gold standard coin. Anyway, we spent 800 years on gold standard, then all yeeted in just 100 years. Yes, the previous monetary system to the last, 100, 150 years actually had been there for a long time. It didn't really change that dramatically until quite recent times. Let's see. Idle time, do you think deflation, as it encourages lower time preference, improves morals in society? I have seen that argument. That when the government is handing out money like candy and you have boom behavior, then it seems like irresponsible behavior suddenly seems like a sane thing to do. And you'll see, like in the 90s with the Silicon Valley, the dot-com boom, you saw these stories about these brilliant young tech guys, and they're cashing out, or I'm sorry, they're going public with their company and having parties on yachts, and they were just in high school 3 years ago or something, right? And you just see all this sort of kind of insane behavior, and it's sort of talked up as if this is the new normal to act crazy, and then the bust comes and everyone's like putting ties back on and stuff.
Well, we saw this during the Great Depression when before the market crashed, there was a whole new types of music were coming in, like jazz and swingers clubs and that sort of stuff were very much in, and this sort of very what we would describe today, especially through a Judeo-Christian lens, is immoral behavior. But afterwards, after the crash during the 1930s, everything became a lot more plain, a lot more so. Things like magazines at the time were saying that the drab is in and simple colors and that sort of stuff. So very modest lifestyle and very modest clothing was popular.
Yeah, so there is a connection. Lawrence says, can you have hyperinflation if you have a gold-backed currency? If you keep the currency truly tied to gold and you don't play games, then I don't think so, because we have not found a way to hyperinflate gold. The gold supply relative to the total gold supply, the amount that we add to the gold supply each year from gold mining or whatever is very, very small. So that's why gold has been a nice money, because from year to year, it's almost like it's not growing at all. It does grow, but it doesn't really make a big difference to how the economy functions. Okay. Idle Time says, what if we start mining gold in asteroids? Well, then you could have, a big influx of gold. It helps that gold is actually useful, unlike paper money. It actually has uses. We use it for industrial purposes and for jewelry and various things. I think if we had more gold, we'd probably use it in electronics, because it actually is, I think, a good conductor. Anyway. Let's see. Lawrence says in the UK they're paying loads of people 80% of their wages if they can't work from home. I assume he means the government. Interesting.
Is that weekly or annual? Is that like just like their week-to-week wage, or is this?
I assume it's their 80. I assume it's 80% of whatever they were making. The government just hands them that. I don't know. Yeah, unemployment benefits. Let's see. There's all kinds of playful stuff in here, which I'm going to skip. Oh, I don't know what he was talking about. He says, didn't the Aussie government do that in 2008? Unfortunately, I don't know what we were talking about at the time.
I think
it would be interesting to
perhaps.
know. Oh, do you know?
I think that was the wage, like giving people their wages, like $1,200 or $1,500 a week.
Did Australia do something like that?
I'm not aware of that.
Okay,
maybe. I was very young at the time, so perhaps. Right. But I don't
here,
know.
Maybe this is it. Somebody else says the Aussie government did helicopter money in 2008 or thereabout via tax returns.
Yeah, there were a lot of tax returns at the time, and I remember because there was a debate about the surplus, because we had a surplus at the time, and now we have a huge deficit because we essentially spent our savings on keeping us out of recession by not collecting taxes and using the savings for day-to-day operations of the government. And now we don't have any savings. So
here's an interesting comment. The other reason why stocks have gone up is it appears that the virus isn't as lethal as previously assumed. Now, that I could believe. When people are starting to maybe get the indication that this is not going to be like a wipeout event, the virus. and so they're very tentatively, being a little more optimistic about our economic future. Let's see.
Yeah. So the market overreacts, and this is one of the
Yeah.
problems with just relying on promotion and feelings for the market, is that emotions and feelings vary wildly day to day. So
Yeah.
if don't simply rely on that.
Peter Young II says, what inflationary, deflationary effects are there from government forgiving private debt? Like, what if the Democrats really did forgive all the student debt? Thoughts on that one?
Well, you would have institutions, the debt is no longer backed by the government, and therefore they're going to get out of that game, which they'll just see an exodus of investment in universities. They'll see an exodus of people being able to get education in universities. Because if the debt's forgiven, then there's no return on their investment.
Austrian School Übermensch, Mad Merck, it was Hoover who increased farmer subsidies, and then Roosevelt responded with the Agricultural Adjustment Act as a result of the huge excess supply. Yeah, that's one of those dumb times where they just were like, here, we'll pay you to farm. And so the farmers produced like way more than was needed of certain things, right? As usual with central planning. And then it was like, oh, what do we do? They're producing all this stuff. And then they just, one intervention leads to another. It's that story. Okay, I am going to have to wrap it up here. Just trying to get to any last comments. Lots of comments. Violent crime stats go up during a boom and down during the bust. I did not know that. And I would be very interested to see evidence of that. You'd think there'd be a Mises.org article. If there isn't, then someone listening to this should write it. If the evidence really is there. Okay, so I think getting towards the end of what we're going to cover today. And I'll just do a nice happy comment. Been just listening, is not as educated on economics as you guys. Still working through Sol's basic econ. Great stream, though. Learned a lot from you. Glad to hear it, Tom. Please keep reading. Get right onto those Austrians after Sol. You could do something that maybe Sol's more of a weak point for Sol, like Rothbard on what has government done to our money. Or what has government done to our money is a short read that would get you into Austrian monetary economics and cure you of a lot of horrible thinking. Okay, yeah, I think we're pretty much there. Okay, excellent.
The money
thanks everybody.
Is rolling in.
Say it again. What's rolling in?
The money is just going to be rolling in, so strap in, everyone. We're in for a rough ride.
Yeah, it should be interesting. But yeah, please do, Mad Merc, for next time. I'm not sure what our main topic will be, but let's do a little economic update on sort of what some of the main indicators, the kind of stuff that Sebastian covers in his
no worries.
Thing each week, right? Yeah. Thank you. I think that would be great because there is so much changing. Normally, if things were more normal, I don't think I'd want that kind of update on a regular basis, but things are changing so much. I think it'd be quite interesting to see what Fed assets and where are interest rates, what has the stock market done over this last 12-month or 6-month period, stuff like that. Should be quite interesting to see what's going on, what we can make of it. Okay, well, thanks, everybody. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Goodbye.